we just finished one podcast and we're doing another one now.
Yeah, we knew that would happen. That would happen. Part 2.
Well, we thought we'd break it up just for people that were really struggling to listen for as long as we were able to talk.
Yeah, we can be quite mad.
But whereas your sort of last podcast we talked about a lot about research and things like that, I think this time I wanted to really focus in on maybe giving some ideas for both parents and professionals that are supporting people with autism that might be helpful, that we've kind of both come across in practice over the years. We've managed to boil it down to sort of 3, although I've written 2 and you appear to have written 1 on my list.
Yes.
Okay, well I'm going to take that as mine then. So really it's 4-2 to Sylvia, but you know they can listen to me anytime.
Yeah,
so
that's not count, but you know the competitive of me. Then
you wanted to win, did you?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I better let you go first then, seeing as you've got 4. So what's your first tip?
Well, my first tip is that, well, first of all, it's just, you know, if you go on the internet, there's a lot of different advice on what to do and what not to do. But I really believe, honestly, that when you have met one person with autism, you just met one person with autism. And I think it's very important to get to know the person. When I'm referred a family or someone who's struggling in any areas, I don't know if I should say that, but I don't tend to read any reports.
Okay.
Because, and that's
Do you
part
need
of
me
your
to edit that
laboratory.
bit out in case
No.
people are still sending you reports?
No, because I could argue my case in the sense that it's not that I dismiss other professionals' opinion, because I do read what they have to say or what they've written and what their impressions are after.
Yes.
But I'm very aware that as human beings we have this tendency, and we'll all do, and I do it too, to actually make assumptions about who that person that we're going to meet is before we've even met them. And I don't want to have that level of biases.
Confirmation
right
bias, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think it's called.
Yeah. Because sometimes you will go, oh yes, he's doing this, it did say in the report that they might do this and that. And I think it's very disrespectful to already make those conclusions about someone. Equally, I wouldn't want people to assume about me. So I think when it comes to someone on the spectrum, I would like to get to know the person. And then just, if I don't understand, then I can go back to reports or what have you, or conversations with people who know that person very well. So that would be my first advice.
Okay.
Then, are we taking turns? I can do that. I can take turns.
I mean, it doesn't sound like you're that willing to, but you know, you need to let me. It is
I did
my
stop
podcast
myself.
at the moment, so
Yeah.
you know, when you start your own, you can invite me on and just not let me say anything. But
Yes, exactly.
I mean, I guess to add to that one as well, because I'm aware that maybe lots of parents will be listening, and that idea of getting to know the person, well, obviously you will know your child, but it's one thing I talk to parents a lot about actually, is that not to forget that they are the expert in their child, and they'll come into contact with lots of people like myself telling them what autism is and what it means and all that kind of stuff, but they'll be the person that knows what that looks like day to day. So I mean, I'm always encouraging the parents I work with to kind of make themselves the expert, to do all the reading they can to understand things and connect that to their child. And that kind of does tie in with not making assumptions, because you know a professional might tell you that this is going to happen, but actually it might be different for you in your situation. You know, I did a little podcast recently about there not being one way of doing things in terms of behaviour support. So you know, if someone, I always feel like if anyone's telling you this is the only way to work, I err on the side of caution. You know, it's dependent on the situation.
Yeah, I do call that paranormal. There's a lot of people.
Paranormal, like ghosts? Or?
Yeah, like the fact that some people might think that they can predict the future.
Oh, okay.
You know, kind of that level of which, you know, paranormal abilities, in the sense that they would say to parents, even nowadays, or he will never be able to do A, B, or C. And my reply is always, oh gosh, I didn't know that he could, read the future.
Yeah.
Because you can't really make those assumptions. And actually, even if it's probable that things might remain slightly more static than, for another person, it's so, kind of heartbreaking for parents to hear that. And it lowers sometimes their expectations as to, what can they do. And I think as a parent myself, that's actually the worst thing that you can say to parents. One, because you don't know for sure that that's going to happen. And two, because, when you're still trying to figure out what it means for your child to have autism, or that you have struggled for some time to get him the right support and for people to understand his or her needs, to hear that is just unnecessary, in my opinion.
Definitely. I'm just checking the time because I did the maths. We did the maths in my head, and I figured if we've got 6 and we've got half an hour, that's 5 minutes each, is it?
Yeah. Well, let's.
We're only a minute over.
Oh, gosh.
That's not too bad for us, to be fair. Okay, so the one that I had up there as number 1, and I think it's something that I've got up on the top of my list because it was something I had to do a lot of when I started doing RDI and practicing the more kind of one-to-one work with individuals on the spectrum, is to be aware of and to adjust your communication style. I'm a talker. I'm not alone in this room as one of those, but I talk quite fast and I use lots of hand movements and gestures, and I probably send a lot of confusing signals for someone who's trying to figure out maybe one piece of the communication. You're nodding far too vigorously there.
Yeah. I'm with you. I'm connecting right in there.
So when one of the things I picked up on in RDI early on was I had to film myself, and that was not only mortifying but also very eye-opening. And so I would always encourage anyone working with someone on the spectrum to just be aware of all the different levels of communication there are, tone of voice, speed of voice, the gestures they make, the facial gestures, the body language, the hand movements, and be able to adjust them so that you can work on each one accordingly. Because one of the things that autism sometimes does is it gives someone that singular attention. That's the way I see it anyway. And if they're attentive to one part of the communication, they might actually struggle with all the other parts at once. So I think awareness and the ability to adjust your communications gives you the tools to support a whole range of people rather than just one particular person.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I tell parents is to go into a playground, go to the park, and just pay attention, even outside the school gates, to pay attention on how parents talk to the kids. Because what I've noticed is that parents will give that feedback so clearly. So if the child is climbing up a wall, they would go, "No, Charlie, don't do that, come off, because you can fall and you will hurt yourself." So it just kind of makes sense of an instruction as to why. And children, very young children, they would go, "No more, hurt myself," or something like that. So they, even if they don't have the whole verbal ability, they kind of link those ideas. But I think autism prevents parents from being able to be declarative and mindful, not because they don't want to, it's because sometimes what it works better is just to say, "No, stop, don't do this."
Yes. Yeah.
And going back to a level of communication where it goes back to that emotional feedback, I think eventually helps the child with autism to put those links together.
and then you can adjust it for the circumstance, can't you? So if you have got a child who's about to run into something dangerous, you can use that no, stop. But then if you're doing some sort of one-to-one interaction, you can be more declarative. I'm really enjoying what we're doing. This is making me feel good. You look very happy. I mean, we talk a lot in our training that we deliver to parents about declarative and directive, and those two differences. So directive being an instruction, a request, or actually a question as well, and then declarative being that kind of statement. So again, it's just understanding all the different nuances of communication, so you can pay attention to the one you use the most.
Yeah, absolutely. And when to use more, when to use less, and when to give that feedback. I think that's a very important one.
It's that I had a parent in the office the other day, and she was very aware of her own sort of interaction with the child, and she said, I just feel like I'm nagging him all the time. Well, why do you feel like you nag him? Because I have to, because he doesn't do what he should be doing. So it's the relationship is affected by the autism, you're not a nagging parent. It's just because that child needs more instruction, you end up giving them lots of instruction, and the child probably ends up seeing you as a source of instruction. And sometimes I feel like one of the best starting points is to start spending time with the child without really saying much at all, and just showing them that you can just be there together without any pressure.
Yeah, and you build those blocks of connections, don't you? And I think as a parent, when you feel that you're nagging them, it's because you lose that sense of connection with your child, because all you do is just give orders. And that's part of growing up and to teach kids, but most of the time what we do is connecting with them, sharing experiences, building that emotional connection. And when you constantly telling what not to do or what they have to do, that sense of collaboration and togetherness goes.
And you've only got so much time as well in the day.
Exactly.
So, okay, so now we kind of touched on collaboration anyway, but that moves you on to
my second one would be whatever you do, make it a collaboration. And it goes back to what we were saying about connecting with the child at whatever level you need to be connecting. Like you were saying that sometimes connection will be being physically present, or connection might mean being available. But those levels of togetherness and the investment that the child has within those social interactions, I think they're very important. Because when we get very little feedback from the autism, then the natural way of connecting is being more imperative and giving a lot more instructions. And we need to view collaboration and connection in a broader way of, sometimes sitting down, holding hands, or sitting next to each other without saying much. That brings that level of connection and collaboration that is so important.
Just kind of togetherness for the sake of it, I guess. Because that's often a starting point for the work, isn't it? Is getting the parent and the child to do things collaboratively. And actually, although you often get the parenting where because the connection's been interrupted, there's a more directive approach, an imperative approach. You quite often also get the child being in charge and bossing to kind of, to reduce the uncertainty of the interaction from their point of view. And so seeking collaboration when it can happen is really important. Loads of parents recently have been telling me that the best time they get connection with their child is actually in the car. Because they're both facing the same way. There's like a sort of certain amount of sensory input, but not maybe too much. And so that was going to be my number 3 actually. So see if there's time, because you've obviously pushed out my number 3. We'll go back
I need to make a number 4. No, but you're right. I mean, I think that is true for all of us. It is true for my husband. If I need to tell him something that I want full attention, I normally do it whilst driving in the car while he's driving. I think it takes those kind of expectations, they ease up that safety. Whereas if you have someone in front of you trying to talk to you, that creates quite an anxiety. But in the car, there's that motion, like you said, that sensory kind of stimulation, but you don't have the parent staring at you. not that they do, but the child might perceive, gosh, I need to perform here, and I don't know really how to do it. Whereas in the car, they can have that shared engagement without the pressures of the interaction.
Well, let's tie it in then, because make it a collaboration would kind of tie in with one of mine, which is a term that I use in lots of training actually, but is get next to them, not opposite. And I use that kind of figuratively and literally. You know, so if I'm doing a session with a young person, I'll very often be, rather than being directly opposite them across the table, I'll be either side by side, or I'll be at a slight angle, so that there's more opportunity for referencing there, or a certain type of referencing there. But also I think it reduces that pressure, it makes it feel more collaborative, and if you can't, you might be listening to this thinking, well, how am I going to collaborate with my child when they seem to just be focused on the object? Well, one of the things you can start to do is do the same activity next to them initially, and then bring that into a joint activity. That's something that I've done with a couple of parents where we're both drawing a picture, and now we're going to draw a picture together, and you kind of scaffold into that. So that's really quickly covered that one, I think. I've lost track of where we are. So we've
number
had
three.
number.
Well, I'm in number 3.
Well, yeah, you would be, because you're just jumping in front of me all the time. I'm on number 2 still.
Oh yes.
No, you go for number 3 for you, Sylvia.
That's so kind. As I march my way through this one. Well, it was going back to your number 1 about adjusting communication, which is giving that feedback. And kind of that goes into, we talked about it briefly, about that modeling and demonstration and giving feedback, not only kind of that emotional sharing of emotions from your part, or I'm having a great time because we are bouncing together, or this activity is going to be so exciting. So that kind of level of language which brings emotional states, I think is very, very important. And also just modeling why you might be doing that. It's just taking the interaction from what are you doing to why are you doing it. And I think it helps the child to view it as a continuum, and kind of having that social goal rather than performance goal, that we need to finish this picture or we need to do the tower. But how the tower, what does it look like, it doesn't really matter. But the process of doing it together in collaboration is so much fun.
Because you've got to kind of, so often with an activity, there's once the child becomes aware of how to do the activity, they no longer really need you, so you've got to give them the value of doing it with you rather than just doing it as opposed to doing it with themselves. And that kind of feedback of how you feel during the activity is really important. Okay. Well, I've got, I think you've done my number 3, so it's very confusing right now, but I think this is potentially the last one. Yeah, so number 6 in total. But I've kind of just got using preferred interests. In terms of the social interaction side of things, and certainly in RDI, that's something I usually steer away from, is if they've got a very fixed interest in something, we try not to use that for the social interaction side of things. But more recently, I've kind of shifted back towards it in terms of helping the parent or a professional plan for engaging the young person in things they find difficult, so education type things, in terms of, for older young people, what are they going to do with their education, which direction are they going to go in. I think you gave me a book recently, you recommended a book recently by Nick Chow.
Oh yes.
About with all the sort of theories on autism, and there was a really good bit in there about educational theory in autism, and how lots of the research shows that reduced field of interest, that narrow field of interest, is actually really important to get them to progress in education. And it's more and more, working with parents of kids in mainstream schools in particular, it does strike me that the education system is kind of set up the wrong way round. for autism, because you start off with all these massive subjects, like 20 subjects or whatever, and you narrow it down to university where you get to pick your favourite topic and immerse yourself in it. And actually, if it was the other way around, maybe we'd have more young people with autism getting to that level of education. I don't know, but
I do agree with that. I think that the key with preferred interest is the degree of that interest, in terms of how much value the child places in that interest. Because there's kind of this dimension between an interest and an obsession.
Yes, yeah.
And I think, I always moved away from kind of obsessive topics when working with anyone on the spectrum, mainly because then it doesn't facilitate that collaboration, because then it is all about the knowledge and the interest that the person has. But using those interests that are not too great that they're going to interfere with them acknowledging you, I think is the way forward. Because if I introduce something that I'm really interested in, but the child doesn't have any motivation whatsoever, then you spend a lot of time trying to engage them in anything. Whereas if you use something that they're passionate about, then you right in there.
It's also, it can often be a springboard for stretching them in areas that they're uncomfortable with. I mean, another chap I'm working with at the moment is, his mum says that the most valuable thing in his life at the moment is geocaching, because it's where he goes to socialise. And admittedly that social interaction is often with older people with the same interests, but it strikes me as odd sometimes that we might steer away from, I know what you're saying about the kind of the rigid topics, but to me it depends on how they're communicating it. If it's constantly just regurgitating facts to you, then that's something that's hard to engage in. But if, like, I had a young person who used to come here, and his sort of enthusiasm was football, and he found out I was from Southampton and that I supported Southampton Football Club. I'm not interested in football, but I didn't need to sort of elaborate on that too much with him. So he would always come up to me and talk to me about that. He'd seek me out, he'd ask me what I thought, he'd interact. It was always about football, but it was an interaction. And it would be odd to kind of not engage in that when I was just thinking then, every time we meet, we talk about autism.
Yeah.
So
I totally agree, and that goes back to the point one of getting to know the individual, and he might have that enthusiasm about football, but that allows him to be curious about your opinions or your ideas about the Sunday match, whatever it is. And it kind of serves as that vehicle for that social interaction.
So how do you approach, because my approach now is if someone's got that kind of rigid interest and they verbalise it a lot, I tend to interject and give my opinion on it and see what they do with that. Do you tend to ignore it and move them on to something else? Or?
No, I actually give the feedback.
Right, so you would say something like, I don't like this topic,
or I don't know much about this topic, or even if the child kind of gets really centered around, say for instance, football, to the point that doesn't stop for me to take turns, then I would say, I would love to say something about that, and then I would just go and say it, even if then he carries on saying his bit, and sometimes they get very desperate because they really want to say what they want to say, and you have interrupted them, so they see you not as another person, and they don't see it as a conversation, they see it as, you are stopping me, an instrumental, I still give the feedback, because that's a way of teaching them, kind of the implicit aspects of conversations, turn taking, sharing information, seeing other people's point of view and all that. So I would use that, but it does depend on the person.
Yeah.
It's just how many obstacles you have to overcome in order to kind of get them into that collaborative state.
And I guess it also, in getting to know the person, I sometimes feel like certain repeated phrases or topics are part of that person's regulation. You know, they're doing it to reduce anxiety, so you've got to be careful sometimes how you interact. But what's lovely with that kind of feedback idea is that you're not stopping it. You're not saying stop talking about that.
No.
You're giving your position back to them, and they can then choose to ignore it, or they can take the information and change.
Yeah, and you know, I do have a young lady who does that. She's able to maintain a conversation, and she's got a fairly good understanding of, but she does tend to get fixated into a detail. So say for instance, if we are in the shops and I drop something and she finds that funny, and she would say, "Oh, you are so clumsy," and we will have a laugh about it, and then she would go on and say, "Oh, you're so clumsy, and then, you know, an hour later she would go, she would still be repeating that. And I've never stopped her, because I think like you were saying, it is her way of kind of maintaining something, regulating herself, and I just tend to allow her to go through that process, and then I will mention something else. Oh well, look at this, or let's do that, or let's go here, and she's able to shift that, and then she might say, "Oh, you dropped that from 2 hours ago," but it's just kind of a monitoring element, and if you know the person, I think it's respectful anyway, just not to say, well, we're not in there anymore, I don't want to hear about whatever happened ever again.
Well, whenever you say stop, they can at some point can say no.
Yeah.
So then what do you do? You can stop, don't you?
Yeah.
Okay, I think that's covered everything on there, isn't it? Because you kind of make no assumptions was part of get to know the person.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Sylvia's first tip was to not read any reports from other professionals.
Yeah, I think we should put it on, kind of as a description of.
Until afterwards, you did say until afterwards.
Yes,
you know.
I don't have such a great ego that I don't read it because I think that rubbish. No, it's just because for my own kind of information gathering.
I was getting really excited then because I hate reading reports. I was thinking, oh, if Sylvia said that I don't have to, then maybe. But I think it's spot on though. It's about making your getting to know the person yourself and who they are with you as well. Because your relationship with them will change their behaviour in lots of ways.
Because no one should be defined by autism. They might be influenced by it, but I don't want to be, kind of knowing someone based on their autism. I want to get to know the person who happens to be autistic. But that's actually my approach to it.
Well, hopefully later on in some of the other episodes, I'm going to get some individuals who have autism to come on the podcast, because I think that would be great for people to sort of get insights. It's an interesting time as a professional, because I think it's really important if I'm working with people with autism to listen to as much information about what they say and what they want. But you get two different schools of thought. You'll get individuals that will say autism is part of who I am, and it's and it should be. I think what's the battle between the terms? It's an autistic person or a person with autism. I tend to swing more to what you were saying, that actually it's an individual with autism. But then if someone wants to be known as autistic, that's their right to do that. So it's hard to kind of find the balance, and I think the more that we listen to people and hear what they're saying as their truth and their story, and that's important, the better. So hopefully
Yeah.
we can get some of them on
Can't
there.
wait to listen to those next.
Well, I might let you come along to some of them if you're available, but it depends if you let me.
Well, it does
Let me
depend
have
on-
at least
I know
half of the 6
Okay.
tips that we've had on there. That, you know.
Yeah, fine.
Well, like I say, people are probably going to get sick of listening to me anyway. So it's great that you've been able to come along and give your expertise.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming, and thanks again for being on the podcast. I can only hope that people listen to it, so then we've got an excuse to do it again.
Yeah, me too.
Excellent.
Me too. Thank you
better
very
go
much.
pick up your kids now.
Yeah, I'm going to go with kids.
Thanks, Silvia.
Thank you.
And thanks everybody for listening.